The Contents of the Dead Man's Pockets, adapted by Jack Finney. At the living room desk, Tom Beneke rolled 2 sheets into his portable typewriter. Enter office memo, the top sheet was headed, and he typed tomorrow's date just below this. Then he glanced at a creased yellow sheet covered with his own handwriting beside the typewriter. Hot in here, he muttered to himself. Then he heard the clang of wire coat hangers in the closet, and this reminded him of his wife. He thought, I'm not hot, no. I have a guilty conscience. He got up, stepped to the living room beside the desk, and stood staring down at Lexington Avenue, 11 stories below. He was a tall, lean, dark-haired young man. He tried his best to open the window, but as usual, the window didn't budge, and he had to lower his hands and then shoot them hard upward to jolt the window open a few inches. But still, he didn't begin his work. He crossed the room to the hallway entrance, and leaning against the door, called, Claire? When his wife answered, he said, Sure you don't mind going alone? No. The tap of her high heels sounded on the wood floor, and she appeared at the end of the little hallway. She smiled at him. It's just that I hate you to miss this movie. You wanted to see it too. Yeah, I know. He ran his fingers through his hair. Gotta get this done, though. She nodded, accepting this. Then, glancing at the desk across the living room, she said, You work too much, though, Tom, and too hard. He smiled. You won't mind, though, when the money comes rolling in and I'm the boss? I guess not. She smiled and went for her coat. Just after 7, she said, I can make the beginning of the first movie. He was tempted to go with her. It was not actually true he had to work tonight, but he really wanted to. This was his personal project, and it could be postponed. But then they wouldn't see it until Monday, he thought, and if I give it to the boss tomorrow, he might read it over the weekend and be impressed. Have a good time, he said aloud. He opened the door for her, feeling the air from the building hallway stream past his face. He watched her walk down the hall, and he started to close the door. As the door opening narrowed, the current of air from the hallway, channeled through the smaller opening now, suddenly rushed past him with force. Behind him, he heard the slap of the window curtains against the wall and the sound of paper fluttering from his desk, and he had to push to close the door. Turning, he saw a sheet of yellow paper moving toward the window. As he watched, the paper struck the bottom edge of the window and hung there for an instant. Then he saw the yellow sheet drop to the window ledge and slide over, out of sight. He ran across the room, staring through the glass. He saw the yellow sheet lying on the ledge a yard below the window. Even as he watched, it was moving, scraping slowly along the ledge, pushed by the breeze. He heaved on the window with all his strength, and it shot open with a bang, the window weight rattling in the casing. But the paper was past his reach, and, leaning out into the night, he watched it move steadily along the ledge. And now the yellow sheet, sliding along the stone ledge, nearly invisible in the night, was stopped by the projecting blank wall of the next apartment. He knelt at the window and stared at the yellow paper for a full minute or more, waiting for it to move, to slide off the ledge and fall, hoping he could follow its course to the street and then hurry down in the elevator and retrieve it. But it didn't move, and he saw that the paper was caught firmly in the corner. He thought about the poker from the fireplace, then the broom, then the mop, discarding each thought as it occurred to him. There was nothing in the apartment long enough to reach that paper. It was hard for him to understand that he actually had to abandon it. It was ridiculous. And he began to curse. Of all the papers on his desk, why did it have to be this one? On countless weekends, he had researched and copies, facts, quotations, and figures onto that sheet. And he had carried it with him to the public library on Fifth Avenue, where he'd spent dozens of lunch hours and early evenings adding more. All of this research was needed to support his idea for a new grocery store displaying method. Without it, his idea was a mere opinion, and there it was lying, countless hours of work, out there on that ledge. For many seconds, he believed he was going to abandon the yellow sheet, that there was nothing else to do. The work could be duplicated, but it would take 2 months, and the time to present this idea was now. He struck his fist on the wooden window ledge. Then he shrugged. But just the same, he thought, this and other independent projects would make him more impressive to his bosses. They were the beginning of the long, long climb to the very top. And he knew he was going out there in that darkness, after the yellow sheet, 15 feet beyond his reach. To simply go out and get his paper was an easy task. He could be back there with it in less than 2 minutes. The ledge he saw, measuring it with his eye, was about as wide as the length of his shoe, and perfectly flat. And every fifth row of brick in the building, he remembered, was indented half an inch, enough for his tips of his fingers, enough to maintain balance easily. It occurred to him that if this ledge wall were only a yard above the ground, he could move along the ledge indefinitely. On a sudden impulse, he got to his feet, walked to the closet, and took out an old jacket. It would be cold outside. He put it on as he crossed the room rapidly toward the open window. In the back of his mind, he knew he'd better hurry and get it over with. He swung a leg over the sill, and then felt for and found the ledge a yard below the window with his foot. Gripping the bottom of the window frame very tightly and carefully, he slowly ducked his head under it. With infinite care, he brought out his other leg, his mind concentrating on what he was doing. Then he slowly stood up. First his right hand, and then his left. He carefully shifted his fingertip grip from the window edging to an indented row of bricks directly to his right. It was hard to take the first shuffling sideways step. And now, with his chest, stomach, and left side of his face pressed against the rough, cold brick, his lighted apartment was suddenly gone, and it was much darker out here than he had thought. Without pause, he continued. Right foot, left foot, right foot, left, his shoes shuffling and scraping along the rough stone, never lifting from it, his fingers sliding along the exposed edging of brick. The ledge was not quite as wide as he'd expected. He simply did not permit himself to look down, though he wanted to. Nor did he actually allow himself to think. Mechanically, right foot, left foot, over and again, he shuffled along crabwise, watching the projecting wall ahead loom steadily closer. Then he reached it, and, at the corner he stood, in the corner formed by the two walls, 1 foot on the ledging of each, a hand on the shoulder-high indentation in each wall. His forehead was pressed directly into the corner against the cold bricks, and now he carefully lowered, first one hand, then the other, perhaps a foot farther down, to the next indentation in the rows of bricks. Very slowly, he lowered his body toward the paper, lying between his outstretched feet. Half squatting, he dropped his left hand to the next indentation and slowly reached with his right hand toward the paper beneath his feet. He couldn't quite touch it, and his knees were now pressed against the wall. But by ducking his head another inch lower, the top of his head was now pressed against the bricks, and he lowered his right shoulder and his fingers toward the paper by a corner, pulling it loose. At the same instant, he saw between his legs and far below, Lexington Avenue stretched out for miles ahead. He saw in that instant the miles of traffic signals, the lights of cars and street lamps, countless neon signs, the moving black dots of people, and a violent explosion of absolute horror roared through him. He began to tremble violently, panic flaring through his mind and muscles, and he felt the blood rush from his skin. In the fractional moment before horror paralyzed him, he jerked upward, but so violently that his head scraped hard against the wall, bouncing off it, and his body swayed outward to a knife edge of balance, and he nearly plunged backward and fell. He was more than trembling now. His whole body was racked with violent shuddering beyond control. His eyes squeezed so tightly shut it was painful. His strength draining from his knees and calves. It was extremely likely, he knew, that he would faint and then drop backward out into nothing. And to save his life, he concentrated on drawing deliberate deep breaths of cold air into his lungs. The strength was gone from his legs. His shivering hands were numb. His easy ability to move and balance were gone. If he tried to move, he thought that he would stumble and fall. He could hear the street traffic far beneath him. During a lull in the street sounds, he called out. Then he was shouting, "Help!" so loudly it rasped his throat. If anyone heard him, there was no sign of it. And presently, Tom Beneke knew he had to try moving. There was nothing else he could do. With fear-soaked slowness, he slid his left foot an inch or two. Then he slid his fingers of his shivering left hand. As his right hand then began to slide along the brick edging, he was astonished to feel the yellow paper pressed to the bricks underneath his stiff fingers. He opened his mouth and took the paper in his teeth, pulling it out from under his fingers. He didn't know how many dozens of tiny sliding steps he had taken, his chest, belly, and face pressed to the wall. A fraction of his mind thought he was going to fall, and he began taking rapid, blind steps with no feeling of what he was doing, sliding with a clumsy, desperate swiftness, fingers scrabbling along the brick. Then he stumbled. His right foot smashed into his left ankle bone. He staggered sideways, began falling, and the claw of his hand cracked against glass and wood, slid down it, and his fingertips were pressed hard on the edging of his window. His right hand smacked beside it as he fell to his knees, and under the full weight of direct downward pull of his body, the open window dropped in its frame till it closed, and his wrist struck the sill. For an instant, he hung suspended between balance and falling, his fingertips pressed onto the quarter-inch wood strips. Elbows slowly bending, he began to draw the full weight of his upper body forward, knowing that the instant his fingers slipped, he'd plunge backward. Then suddenly, the strain slackened and ended, his chest touching the windowsill, and he was kneeling on the ledge, his forehead pressed to the glass of the closed window. His head moved, and in faint reflection from the glass, he saw the yellow paper clenched in his front teeth. Lifting a hand from the sill, he took it from his mouth and crushed it into the side pocket of his jacket. He couldn't open the window. It had been pulled not completely closed, but there was no room to get his fingers underneath it. He couldn't push it open either. The upper window panel, he knew, was impossible to move, frozen tight with dried paint. Very carefully, he drew back his right hand, palm facing the glass, and he struck the glass with the heel of his hand. His arm rebounded from the pain, his body tottering. He knew he didn't dare strike a harder blow. After a few moments, he slipped off his shoe and drew back his arm as far as he dared, and struck the leather heel against the glass. The pain rattled, but he knew he'd been a long way from breaking it. His foot was cold, and he slipped the shoe back on. He shouted again, but there was no answer. He couldn't possibly wait here until Claire came home. It was the second movie she'd wanted to see, and she'd left in time to see the first. She'd be another 3 hours or... He glanced at his watch. Claire had been gone 8 minutes. It wasn't possible, but only 8 minutes ago, he had kissed his wife goodbye. She wasn't even at the theater yet. It would be 4 hours before she could possibly be home. He couldn't possibly stay out here for 4 hours, or anywhere near it. Long before that, his legs and arms would give out. Quite realistically, he knew that he would fall. No one could stay out on this ledge for 4 hours. There were a dozen coins in Tom Beneke's pocket, and he dropped them, 3 or 4 at a time. But if they struck anyone, or if anyone noticed their falling, no one connected them with their source. Clinging to the window with one hand, he again searched his pockets. But now there was nothing left but the yellow sheet. It occurred to him that his death on the sidewalk would be an eternal mystery. The window closed. Why? How? And from where could he have fallen? No one would be able to identify his body for a time either. The thought was somehow unbearable and increased his fear. All they'd find in his pockets would be the yellow sheet, contents of the dead man's pockets, one sheet of paper bearing penciled notations. Incomprehensible. He understood fully that he was probably going to die. His arms, maintaining their balance on the ledge, were trembling steadily now. And it occurred to him that if he fell, all his life would have been lived. Nothing then could ever be changed, and nothing more could ever be added to his life. He wished then that he had not allowed his wife to go off by herself tonight and on similar nights. He thought of all the evenings he had spent away from her, working, and he regretted them. He thought of the hours he'd spent by himself filling the yellow sheet that had brought him out here. Contents of the dead man's pockets, he thought with sudden fierce anger. A wasted life. He simply was not going to cling there until he slipped and fell. He told himself that now. There was one last thing he could try. He could drive his fist forward against the glass. If it broke, he was safe. He might cut himself badly, and probably would, but with his arm inside the room, he would be secure. But if the glass did not break, the rebound flinging his arm back would topple him off the ledge. He was certain of that. The thought of Claire, and then drew his arm and tight fist back just a bit more. Then with full power, with every last scrap of strength he could bring to bear, he shot his arm forward through the glass and he yelled, "Claire!" He heard the blow. He heard the sound, felt the blow, felt himself falling forward, and his hand closed on the living room curtains, the shards and fragments of glass showering onto the floor. And then, kneeling there on the ledge, his arm thrust into the room up to the shoulder, he began picking away the protruding slivers and great wedges of glass from the end of the frame, tossing them onto the rug. And as he grasped the edge of the empty window frame and climbed into his home, he was grinning with triumph. He simply turned to his desk, pulled the crumpled yellow sheet from his pocket, and laid it down there where it had been, smoothing it out. And he absently laid a pencil across to weigh it down. He shook his head wonderingly. He opened the front door and stepped out to go find his wife. He turned to pull the door closed, and the air from the hall rushed through the narrow opening again. As he saw the yellow paper, pencil flying, scooped off the desk, and not stopped by the glassless window, sail out into the night and out of his life, Tom Beneke burst into laughter and then closed the door behind him.